The room smelled like white lilies and grief. Someone had arranged 3 enormous bouquets near the entrance of the funeral home. White lilies, white roses, white carnations. And the scent was so thick, it felt like something you had to push through just to breathe. I remember thinking that Richard would have hated it. He was a man who preferred the smell of fresh-cut grass and motor oil, of Sunday mornings and old books. He would have looked at those flowers and said, "Michelle, who ordered a florist's entire inventory?" And I would have laughed, and he would have squeezed my hand, and everything would have been fine. But Richard was in the casket at the front of the room, and nothing was fine, and I hadn't laughed in 11 days. I was sitting in the front row, which is where they put widows, as if proximity to the dead is some kind of honor, as if being closest to the loss is a privilege rather than a punishment. My hands were folded in my lap. I was wearing the black dress Richard had once told me, made me look elegant, and I had put on pearl earrings because pearls were what you wore to funerals, and I was doing all the things you were supposed to do, and I felt absolutely nothing except a hollow, echoing ache that started somewhere behind my sternum and radiated outward into my fingertips. People kept coming up to me. They kept touching my shoulder, pressing my hand between both of theirs, leaning down to murmur things into my ear. "He was such a good man. We're so sorry, Michelle. If there's anything you need." I nodded at all of them. I said thank you. I said yes, he was. I said I appreciate that. My voice came out steady and even, which surprised me, because inside I felt like a building that had been demolished from the inside, still standing on the outside, all the walls in place but completely hollow. Nothing left within. Richard had been sick for 2 years. Pancreatic cancer, which is the kind of diagnosis that a doctor delivers in a quiet voice while looking somewhere slightly to the left of your face, because even doctors cannot look you in the eye when they are telling you that the person you love most in the world has somewhere between 8 and 18 months. We had gotten 23. 23 months of fighting, of experimental treatments, of good days and terrible days, of nights when I lay awake listening to him breathe just to make sure he was still breathing. 23 months of loving him harder than I had ever loved anything in my entire life, because when you know the clock is running down, you stop taking a single second for granted. He died on a Tuesday. It was raining. I was holding his hand, and now it was Friday, and I was sitting in the front row of Whitmore and Sons Funeral Home in Greenwich, Connecticut, surrounded by the smell of white lilies, and our daughter Cassandra was walking toward me with a look on her face that I had learned, over the past 11 days, to recognize. It was not a grief look. It was a business look. Cassandra had her father's sharp cheekbones and her grandmother's pale green eyes, and when she had something on her mind, those eyes went very still and very focused, like a camera lens adjusting to bring something into clarity. She leaned down and touched my elbow. "Mom," she said, quietly enough that the people around us wouldn't hear. "Can I talk to you for a second? Just in the side hallway. It'll only take a minute." I looked at the casket. I looked at her. Then I stood up and followed her. The side hallway was narrow and lined with framed watercolor prints of pastoral landscapes, the kind of generic, inoffensive art that exists in dentist offices and funeral homes and hotel rooms, art designed to be looked through, rather than at. Cassandra stopped at the end of the hallway and turned to face me. Her husband, Derek, was standing a few feet back, and I noticed he had positioned himself between us and the main room, which meant this was not a spontaneous conversation. This had been arranged. "Mom," Cassandra said, and her voice was careful in the way that a person's voice is careful when they have rehearsed what they are about to say. I know this isn't the ideal time, and I'm so sorry to bring this up today. I really am. But there are some things that need to be addressed soon, and Derek and I have been talking to our attorney, and he says that the sooner we get the estate process started, the better. For everyone. I looked at her. The inheritance papers, she said. Dad's estate. We just need to know when you're planning to start the process, when you'll be ready to sit down and go over everything and sign. The hallway was very quiet. From the main room I could hear the low murmur of voices, someone crying softly, the distant sound of organ music being piped through speakers. I looked at my daughter standing in front of her father's casket. A casket that was 30 feet away, visible through the open doorway at the end of the hall, asking me when I was going to sign the papers that would divide up what remained of his life. I didn't answer her. I looked at her for a long moment, long enough that a faint flush began to creep up her neck. Then I turned and walked back down the hallway, back to the front row, back to my seat, and I sat down and folded my hands in my lap, and I stayed there until the very end. I didn't respond. I didn't explain, and I didn't tell her, not that day, not for several weeks afterward. The thing that Richard had done in secret. The thing that had been quietly, carefully, legally set in motion long before he took his last breath on that rainy Tuesday morning. The thing that was going to change everything. Cassandra thought she had already decided. But I'm getting ahead of myself. If this is your first time here, welcome. My name is Michelle, and I want to tell you a story. It's a story about marriage and family and money and betrayal. But more than anything, it's a story about a man who loved his wife enough to protect her even after he was gone. Before I go any further, if you're watching this and you've ever been through something like what I'm about to describe, if you've ever sat in a room with people you loved and realized that love was not what was looking back at you, please leave me a comment below. You are not alone. And if you're new here, please subscribe and hit that notification bell, because I promise you want to hear how this ends. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. I grew up in a small town in western Massachusetts called Hadley. It's the kind of town that people who grew up there remember with a complicated mixture of affection and claustrophobia. Beautiful in autumn when the maples turned every shade of red and gold. Quiet in winter, agricultural in a way that gave the whole place a certain unhurried dignity. My father, Thomas, was a civil engineer. My mother, Barbara, taught 4th grade for 31 years. We were comfortable but not wealthy. A 4-bedroom colonial on Maple Street, a Ford station wagon, vacations to Cape Cod, college funds that required scholarships to stretch far enough. My parents believed in education and hard work and keeping your word, and they raised me and my younger brother Gary to believe in those things too. I was not the kind of girl who dreamed about luxury. I was the kind of girl who dreamed about purpose. I wanted to build something. I wanted to make something that mattered. I studied architecture at UMass Amherst. Switched to interior design in my junior year when I realized what I truly loved was the relationship between space and human emotion. The way a room could make you feel small or expansive, anxious or at peace, depending on the choices made in its construction. I graduated in 1988, moved to Boston, got a job at a small design firm on Newbury Street, and started learning everything I could as fast as I could. I met Richard Hargrove at a client dinner in the spring of 1990. He was 32, tall, with dark hair that was already starting to silver at the temples, and a way of listening to people that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. He was a partner at a private equity firm, which meant he was serious and analytical and comfortable with numbers in a way that I, a person who chose architecture because it was math, made beautiful, was not. He ordered the fish. He asked me 3 intelligent questions about my work, and at the end of the evening he asked if he could call me. He called the next morning. We dated for 1.5 years, which was long enough to be certain, and short enough that the certainty still felt like electricity. We got married in September of 1991 at a small ceremony in Hadley, in the backyard of my parents' house, under a tent that kept threatening to come loose in the wind. Richard held both my hands during the vows and looked at me like I was something he still couldn't quite believe was real. I have a photograph from that moment. My mother kept it framed on her mantelpiece until the day she died. And every time I look at it, I can remember exactly how I felt, like I had found the one person in the world who was entirely on my side. We moved to Greenwich 2 years later, when Richard's firm relocated and expanded. Greenwich was a different world from Hadley. Old money, manicured lawns, children in private school uniforms, women with last names that appeared on hospital wings and library buildings. I felt like an outsider for years. I kept my Boston directness and my Massachusetts vowels and my habit of saying exactly what I thought, and I watched the women around me perform a kind of social grace that I admired but could not replicate. Richard loved this about me. He called it my superpower. He said, "Michelle, you are the only person in any room you enter who says exactly what she means, and that is the most powerful thing in the world." I built my interior design business slowly, carefully, the way you build anything that you want to last. By 1998, I had a studio in Stamford and 4 full-time employees. By 2003, we had worked on homes and commercial spaces from Connecticut to Manhattan to the Hamptons, and my reputation was good enough that new clients came primarily through referrals. Richard and I had bought the house in Greenwich by then, a 7-bedroom Tudor on nearly 3 acres with a garden that became my second obsession after my work. We had Cassandra in 1994 and our son Matthew in 1997. Those years, the late 90s, the early 2000s, I remember them as the good years. Not because they were perfect. Nothing is ever perfect. Richard worked too much, and there were stretches when I felt more like a single parent than a partner. My business had difficult seasons, clients who were impossible, projects that went over budget and over deadline. Cassandra and Matthew fought the way all siblings fight, with a ferocity that seemed designed specifically to strip every last nerve I had. There were arguments and misunderstandings and ordinary disappointments, but underneath all of it was something solid, something that held. Richard and I talked every night. That was our rule. No matter how late he got home, no matter how tired either of us was, we sat together in the kitchen with whatever was left of dinner and we talked. About the kids, about work, about the world, about nothing in particular. He had a way of asking questions that made me feel interesting. I had a way of making him laugh that he said nobody else could replicate. We were a team. We were, in the truest sense of the word, partners. Cassandra grew up beautiful and brilliant and difficult. She had Richard's mind and something else, something harder, more calculating, that I couldn't entirely identify the source of. She was competitive in a way that sometimes frightened me. Not because competitiveness is a flaw, but because Cassandra's competitiveness had no off switch. She competed in everything: grades, social standing, appearance, achievement, with an intensity that left little room for joy. She went to Dartmouth, then to Columbia Law, then to a prestigious firm in Manhattan, where she made partner in 8 years, which was fast, which everyone told her was impressive, which she acknowledged without any visible pleasure because Cassandra did not measure success by the approval of others. She measured it by the distance between where she was and where she had decided she should be. She married Derek Calloway when she was 34. Derek was handsome and affable, and the kind of man who seemed, in social situations, like a genuinely pleasant person. He laughed easily. He remembered names. He was good at parties. But there was something behind the pleasantness, a watchfulness, a quality of always seeming to calculate what a room required from him, that I noticed early and kept to myself. Richard noticed it too. He told me once, late at night in our kitchen, that Derek reminded him of certain people he'd encountered in business over the years. "Not bad people," Richard said carefully. "Just people who are always aware of the bottom line." Matthew was different from his sister in almost every way. Where Cassandra was sharp and contained, Matthew was warm and expansive and generous in a way that sometimes made me think he had inherited all the softness that Cassandra had declined to claim. He became a landscape architect, which delighted me. My son, working with space and nature, making the outside world more beautiful. He lived in Portland, Oregon, with his wife Clara and their 2 daughters, and he called me every Sunday without fail. He had cried for 3 days when his father was diagnosed. He had flown to Connecticut 4 times in the final year, spending weeks at a time helping me with Richard's care, sitting with his father for hours, reading to him, watching baseball with him, just being there. Cassandra had visited twice in the final year. I want to be careful here because I am telling you a story about my daughter, and I need you to understand that this is not a story I ever wanted to tell. I did not want to be a woman sitting in front of a camera, talking about the ways her child had failed her. I spent years, making excuses for Cassandra, finding explanations for her distance, her coldness, her apparent inability to prioritize anything above her own interests. I told myself she was busy. I told myself she processed grief differently. I told myself that her ambition was a kind of armor she had needed, that somewhere beneath the armor was the little girl who used to fall asleep in my lap, watching old movies on Sunday afternoons. But I am 61 years old, and I have lived long enough to know the difference between armor and a person who has simply decided that other people are primarily useful. The shift, the real shift, the one that made everything that came after inevitable, began about 3 years before Richard died. He had just turned 65. We had been talking about retirement, about what the next chapter looked like, about finally taking the trip to Italy we had been promising ourselves for 20 years. He was healthy then, or seemed to be. The diagnosis was still more than a year away. We were planning, which is what you do when you still believe the future is a place you are going to. Cassandra came to dinner on a Saturday in October. She came alone. Derek was, she said, at a conference in Chicago, and she was unusually attentive all evening, asking Richard about his plans for the firm, about his partners, about the structure of the business. She had always been interested in Richard's work, which I had always attributed to her legal training and her general interest in financial matters. But looking back now, with the clarity that comes from knowing how the story ends, I can see that the interest that evening had a specific quality, a targeted quality. She was not asking general questions. She was mapping terrain. After dinner, while I was cleaning up in the kitchen, I heard Cassandra say something to Richard in the living room. I was running water, so I didn't catch it clearly. Just a phrase, something about estate planning and making sure everything is structured properly. I didn't think much of it then. Cassandra was a lawyer. Estate planning was the kind of thing she would naturally think about. But Richard came into the kitchen about 15 minutes later, after Cassandra had said goodnight and left, and he was quiet in a way that was different from his usual quietness. He stood at the kitchen counter and poured himself a glass of water, and didn't say anything for a moment. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Fine," he said. Then, "Michelle, when did Cassandra start caring so much about what happens to the house?" I turned from the sink and looked at him. "What do you mean?" He told me then what Cassandra had said. She had asked him, apparently with some directness, about his plans for the estate, specifically about the house, specifically about whether he had considered putting it in a trust, specifically about what would happen to it if something happened to him. I felt something shift in my chest when he told me, something small and cold. "She's probably just being practical," I said. "You know how she is." Richard nodded slowly, but the quiet didn't leave his face. He didn't bring it up again for several months. Life continued. The following spring, Richard went in for his annual physical, and the doctor found something. Then another doctor found something else. Then we were sitting in an oncologist's office in New Haven on a bright April morning, and the world divided itself permanently into before and after. The first months of Richard's illness were consumed entirely by the illness itself, by the appointments and the treatment protocols and the research and the fear, by the enormous daily work of loving someone who is dying and refusing to let them die alone in their own terror. Matthew flew in immediately. My friend Carol, who had known me since the children were small, came and stayed for 2 weeks. My brother Gary drove down from Massachusetts every other weekend. Cassandra sent flowers. She called twice a week, which was regular but somehow felt like the performance of regularity rather than its substance. When I told her the diagnosis and prognosis in detail, she was quiet for a moment and then said, in a measured voice, "Okay, I'll make sure we get the estate paperwork in order. That's going to be important." She paused and then added, "And of course, I'm so sorry, Mom. This is terrible news." The condolences came after the practicalities, and I noticed, and I filed it away somewhere deep. She visited that first month, stayed for a weekend. She was kind to Richard in a way that was technically impeccable. She sat with him, she spoke to him directly, and without the false brightness that some people adopt around the ill. She brought him a book he had mentioned wanting to read. But there was a quality of distance that I couldn't ignore, a sense that she was present in body while something important remained elsewhere. The second visit was 6 months later. By then, Richard's condition had progressed significantly. He was thinner. He tired easily. He had good days and difficult days, and this particular weekend happened to be a difficult one. Cassandra arrived on Friday evening, and on Saturday morning, while Richard was resting and Matthew, who happened to be visiting simultaneously, was in the garden with the girls. She found me in the kitchen and sat down across from me at the table. "Mom," she said, "I need to talk to you about the estate." I was making coffee. I kept my back to her for a moment, pouring water into the reservoir, pressing the button, listening to the machine begin its work. "Not right now, Cassandra," I said. "I know the timing is difficult," she said. "But there are things that need to be decided. The house, the firm's assets, the investment accounts. Dad needs to make decisions now, while he's still legally competent to do so, and those decisions affect all of us." I turned around then. "I understand the legal realities," I said. "Your father and I have an estate attorney. We've been handling it." "I know you have Gerald," she said. "Gerald Whitmore was indeed our attorney, a man I had trusted completely for 15 years. But I've done some research, and there are strategies Gerald may not be recommending that would be significantly more advantageous for the whole family." I looked at her across the kitchen table. My husband was in the room above us, sleeping through pain that his medication was managing, but not eliminating, and my daughter was sitting in my kitchen talking about strategies. "What kind of strategies?" I asked because I needed to know. She outlined them efficiently. A restructuring of assets, a series of trusts, changes to the distribution arrangements that would, she explained, protect everyone from unnecessary estate taxes and ensure that the family wealth was preserved across generations. She had printed documents. She produced a folder from her bag, and she set them on the table between us. I looked at the folder. I didn't open it. "And how would these strategies affect my position?" I asked. "As Richard's spouse." Cassandra's green eyes met mine steadily. "You would be provided for," she said, "completely and appropriately. This isn't about leaving you without resources. It's about making sure the assets are structured in a way that makes sense going forward." "Provided for," I repeated. "Comfortably," she said. "There would be an income arrangement. The house, depending on the trust structure, might need to be." She paused. "There are different options." "The house might need to be what?" I asked. "It might need to be part of the trust rather than held in your name directly," she said. "Which is actually a protection, legally. It would shield it from any potential." "Cassandra," I said. My voice came out very quiet. "Your father is upstairs. He is alive. I am going to ask you not to bring this to me again." She held my gaze for a moment, then she nodded once, closed the folder, put it back in her bag, and stood up. She left the next morning, a day earlier than planned. What I didn't know then, what I would not find out until several months after Richard died, was that Cassandra had not taken that folder home unused. She had, in the weeks and months that followed, begun a quiet campaign. She had called Gerald Whitmore's office twice, identifying herself as the family's legal counsel and requesting information about the estate structure that Gerald, correctly, had declined to provide without Richard's explicit authorization. She had also, I later learned, reached out to two of Richard's business partners, men she had met socially over the years at firm events, asking indirect questions about the value of Richard's equity stake and the procedures that would govern its transfer upon death. She was building a picture. She was calculating, and Richard knew. I don't know exactly when he figured it out. He never told me directly, not until much later, not until the conversation we had about 3 months before he died, the conversation I will tell you about soon. But I know that Richard was a man who had spent 35 years in private equity, which is a business that rewards, above all, the ability to read people and anticipate their moves. He had not built what he built by being naive about human nature, and Cassandra, whatever else she was, had his mind, which meant that on some level, he had always known what she was capable of. He had just hoped, I think, that she wouldn't aim it at her own family. The last year of Richard's life was the most intimate year of our marriage. That sounds strange, perhaps, when I say it, that the year of his dying was also the year we were closest. But illness strips away everything extraneous. You stop spending time on what doesn't matter, because time has become too visibly finite. We talked more in that year than we had in the decade before. We said things we had always meant to say, and never quite gotten around to saying. We lay in bed at night, and he told me stories from his childhood in Ohio that I had never heard, and I told him about the summer I was 17, when I had thought about becoming a painter, and we laughed together at the absurdity of all the things we had worried about over the years that had amounted to nothing. Matthew was extraordinary during that time. He structured his work so that he could spend long stretches in Greenwich, and when he was there, the house felt different, warmer, more alive. He and Richard watched baseball together for hours. Matthew would sit on the edge of the bed and do the voices for all the players and make Richard laugh until he had to be careful about his breathing. I would stand in the doorway sometimes and watch them together and feel something that was simultaneously grief and gratitude in proportions I couldn't separate. Cassandra called regularly. She did not visit again until the final month. 3 months before Richard died, on a Sunday evening in October, he asked me to sit with him in his study. He was having a good day. Not a good day in the way days used to be good, before the illness, but a good day in the way that had become our new measurement. Alert, relatively comfortable, himself in the ways that mattered. He was in the leather chair by the window. The garden was visible through the glass, the maples at their full autumn peak, the light going gold and horizontal. He asked me to close the door. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to listen completely before you respond, because there are things I should have told you sooner, and I'm sorry I didn't, and I need you to hear all of it before you say anything." I sat down across from him, and I listened. He had known, he told me, for about 1.5 years, since roughly 6 months after his diagnosis, that Cassandra had been making inquiries. He had found out initially through Gerald, who had called him after Cassandra's second attempt to obtain information about the estate, and had said carefully and professionally that he thought Richard should be aware of the contact. He had also heard from one of his partners, who had mentioned Cassandra's questions in passing, not fully understanding their significance. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. I kept my voice even, but my hands were very still in my lap. "Because I wanted to handle it," he said. "I didn't want you to have to carry it. You were already carrying so much." He looked at me. "I know that was wrong. I know it should have been our decision together. I'm sorry." I absorbed this. Then I asked, "What did you do?" He told me. About 14 months ago, Richard had gone to see a different attorney, not Gerald. Gerald handled the estate planning for both of us, and Richard wanted this done separately, cleanly, with absolute confidentiality. He had gone to see a woman named Patricia Nguyen, who had been recommended to him by a trusted friend as the most thorough estate attorney in the state of Connecticut. He had spent several sessions with Patricia, sessions he had scheduled during his treatment appointments, which gave him built-in cover, and together they had restructured certain elements of his estate in ways that were entirely legal, entirely binding, and entirely invisible until they were executed. He described what he had done in careful detail. He described the structure of the trust he had created. He described the conditions. He described what it meant for me, and what it meant for Cassandra, and what it meant for Matthew. By the time he finished, the room was dark. Neither of us had thought to turn on a light. "Richard," I said finally. "I know," he said. "She's our daughter." "I know," he said again. His voice was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the illness. "And I love her. I will always love her. But she has made certain choices, and I needed to make sure that those choices did not result in you losing your home, or your stability, or your future. I needed to know that you were protected, even after." He stopped. He looked at the dark garden. "Even after?" I went to him then. I sat on the arm of his leather chair, and I put my arms around him, and he leaned his head against me, and we stayed like that for a long time without speaking. He made me promise not to tell Cassandra. Not yet, not until it was time. I promised. He died 8 weeks later, on a Tuesday, in the rain, with my hand in his. The weeks after the funeral were a specific kind of terrible that I had not anticipated. Not the grief, which I had anticipated, but the logistics. The grinding, relentless mechanics of death, the death certificates, the probate filings, the account notifications, the insurance claims, the firm's succession procedures. I was grateful for Gerald, who handled most of it with quiet competence. I was grateful for Matthew, who stayed for 3 weeks and fielded phone calls and made sure I ate something every day. I was grateful for Carol, who came every morning and sat with me in the kitchen and didn't try to make any of it better. Cassandra and Derek came for the first 2 weeks. They stayed at a hotel in town. The house, Cassandra said, was more convenient for everyone if it wasn't overcrowded, which was perhaps true, and perhaps something else. She was organized and efficient during those 2 weeks in ways that were practically useful. She coordinated the reception after the funeral. She managed correspondence with the extended family. She spoke to the funeral home with the crisp, professional manner that these places seemed to find reassuring. And she pressed, in small, persistent ways, about the estate. Not in large, dramatic confrontations. Cassandra was too intelligent for that. It was questions. Gentle, reasonable-sounding questions. Have you talked to Gerald yet about next steps? Is there a timeline for the probate process? Derek says there are some tax considerations that should probably be addressed fairly quickly. Each question was wrapped in concern, in practicality, in the language of family welfare. Each question was, underneath the wrapping, a hand reaching toward the future she had already decided she was entitled to. I answered her questions minimally. I said Gerald was handling it. I said I wasn't ready to discuss timelines. I said I needed more time. And then there was the moment in the side hallway of the funeral home, the one I told you about at the beginning. She asked me when I was going to sign the inheritance papers. I looked at the casket. I looked at her. I didn't answer. I walked back to my seat, and something settled in me then. Something quiet and certain, the way a key turns in a lock. I had made a promise to Richard. I intended to keep it. The weeks after the funeral continued. Cassandra and Derek returned to Manhattan. The calls and the questions continued. About timing, about documents, about meetings with Gerald. I told her Gerald was still working through the estate. I told her it was a process. I told her I would let her know. She arrived unannounced one Saturday morning in November, 6 weeks after the funeral. She had a key. She had always had a key. And I was in the kitchen when I heard the front door, and then Cassandra and Derek were both standing in my kitchen at 8:45 in the morning. I was in the neighborhood, she said, which was not even a plausible excuse given that Greenwich was 90 minutes from Manhattan. But she offered it anyway. I thought we could have coffee and go over a few things. Derek stood by the refrigerator and looked at the floor, and I thought for a moment that he had the grace to be at least slightly uncomfortable, but only slightly. I made coffee. I sat across from my daughter at the kitchen table where I had made every important decision of my adult life, and I listened to her present what she called her proposal. It was detailed. She had clearly worked on it extensively, probably with legal counsel, possibly with Derek's input, possibly with the input of people I didn't know. The proposal involved a restructuring of the estate that would place the primary assets, the house, the investment accounts, Richard's equity from the firm, into a family trust with Cassandra as the primary trustee. I would receive what she called a generous living arrangement, the use of the house for my lifetime, and an annual income drawn from the trust. Matthew would receive a lump sum distribution, which she noted was fair given his different financial situation. Everything else would be managed under Cassandra's oversight. She slid the documents across the kitchen table toward me. "I know this is a lot to process," she said, "but from a tax efficiency standpoint, this structure makes the most sense. Gerald actually agrees with the general approach. I spoke with him last week." "You spoke with Gerald?" I said. "Just a preliminary conversation," she said. "He confirmed that a trust structure of this kind would have certain advantages." I looked at the documents. I looked at my daughter. I thought about Richard in his leather chair in the dark study, telling me what he had done. I thought about the promise I had made. "I'll think about it," I said. She blinked, apparently having expected something more immediately contentious. "Of course," she said. "Take your time. But I do want to note that Gerald mentioned there are some deadlines in the probate process that we don't want to." I said I'll think about it, I said. After they left, I sat in the kitchen for a long time without moving. Then I called Patricia Nguyen. I had Patricia's number because Richard had given it to me during that conversation in the study, written on a small card in his careful handwriting that I had kept in my jewelry box. I had not called her yet. Richard had said there would be a time, and I had trusted him that I would know when that time was. I knew now. Patricia answered on the second ring. Her voice was exactly as Richard had described, calm, precise, and completely unflappable. "Mrs. Hargrove," she said, "I've been expecting your call. I'm so sorry for your loss. Your husband was a remarkable man." "He was," I said. "I think," she said, "it's time for us to meet." We met the following Thursday at her office in Hartford, a deliberate distance from Greenwich, from Cassandra's sphere of influence, from anyone who might recognize my car or notice my arrival. Patricia's office was on the 7th floor of a glass building downtown, with a view of the Connecticut River and a quality of hushed competence that I found immediately steadying. Patricia Nguyen was in her early 50s, with dark hair pulled back severely and reading glasses that she wore on a chain around her neck and deployed with precise efficiency. She had been working in estate law for 25 years. She had represented, she told me, a number of situations with dynamics similar to mine. She did not seem surprised by anything I told her. She laid out for me, in careful and thorough detail, everything Richard had arranged. 14 months before his death, Richard had established what Patricia called a revocable living trust with very specific distribution provisions. He had placed into this trust the majority of his assets, the Greenwich house, fully paid for and valued at approximately $4 million, his investment accounts, totaling approximately $11 million, his share of proceeds from the sale of his equity stake in the firm, which his partners had agreed to buy out over a structured period, and which would eventually total approximately $7 million, and several additional properties and accounts that brought the total estate value to approximately $26 million. The trust had two primary beneficiaries, me and Matthew. I was named as the primary beneficiary, with full and unconditional ownership of the house, full control of a dedicated account containing $5 million for my immediate use and security, and a proportional share of all remaining assets, with no conditions attached and no oversight required. The trust named me as my own trustee for my portion, meaning that no one, including Cassandra, had any legal authority over anything that belonged to me. Matthew was named as secondary beneficiary, with a direct distribution of $3 million and a share of the remaining assets that reflected. As Richard had put it in the trust documents, Patricia showed me this section. My profound gratitude for his presence, his love, and his extraordinary care during the most difficult time of my life. Cassandra was named in the trust as well, She received $1, and a letter. Patricia handed me the letter. It was in Richard's handwriting, on his personal stationery, the kind with the small embossed R in the corner that he had used for personal correspondence for as long as I could remember. I read it. I will not reproduce it here in its entirety, because some of it belongs only to our family. But I will tell you that Richard was precise and clear, and entirely without malice. He wrote that he loved Cassandra and always would. He wrote that he had watched her become someone he did not recognize, and that he had mourned that for years before he ever received his diagnosis. He wrote that he could not in good conscience reward behavior that had caused harm to the people he loved most. He wrote that he hoped, with time and reflection, she would understand why he had made the choices he made. He wrote that the door to a real relationship, not one based on assets and calculations, but a real relationship, the kind they had once had when she was small, and the world had not yet taught her that love was a transaction. That door was not closed, that it would never be closed. He wrote that he was sorry he was not there to say this to her in person. I folded the letter and held it for a long time. "When does this become active?" I asked Patricia. "It already has," she said. "The trust was structured to activate automatically upon your husband's death. Everything is already in place. The house is already yours, unencumbered. The accounts have already transferred. The only remaining step is the formal notification of all named beneficiaries, which my office will handle." "When?" I asked. "Whenever you're ready," she said. I thought about Cassandra at the funeral home, leaning down in the side hallway, asking me when I was going to sign the papers. I thought about the look on her face when I didn't answer. I thought about the folder she had brought to my kitchen table, the proposal with its careful language about living arrangements and trustee oversight. I thought about the 2 years she had been building toward this, the calls to Gerald, the questions to Richard's partners, the quiet, persistent architecture of assumption. "Give me until after the holidays," I said, "and then send the notification." Patricia nodded. "Of course." I drove home in the early afternoon, through Connecticut in November, the trees bare, the light already thinning toward 4 o'clock. I pulled into the driveway of my house, fully and unconditionally mine, and I sat in the car for a moment before going inside. I thought about Richard. I thought about him sitting in his leather chair in the dark study, the gold leaves of the maples visible through the window, telling me what he had done because he wanted me to know I was safe. I thought about everything he had built and everything he had protected, and the quiet, methodical love that had made him spend the last year of his life ensuring that even after he was gone, I would be all right. I went inside. I made dinner. I called Matthew. "Dad took care of everything," I told him, when I had explained what Patricia had told me. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Of course he did," Matthew said finally. His voice was rough. "Of course he did." The notification went out in the second week of January. Patricia's office sent it by certified mail and electronic delivery, simultaneously to all named beneficiaries. It was a formal legal document, precise and unambiguous, outlining the terms of the trust and the distribution to each named party. I was at home when Cassandra called. It was a Thursday morning. I was in the garden, even though it was January, because I had found that the garden was the place where I could be most quiet and most myself, even in winter, even with nothing growing. My phone rang. I looked at the screen. I took a breath. I answered. "Mom." Her voice was unlike anything I had heard from her in years. Not controlled, not measured, not carefully managed. Raw. Mom, what is this? What did Dad do? What is this document? It's exactly what it says it is, I said. $1? Her voice cracked on the words. He left me $1. He left you a letter, I said. Did you read the letter? Silence. Cassandra, I said, and my voice was gentle, because underneath everything, underneath the wake and the hallway and the folder on the kitchen table and 2 years of quiet maneuvering, she was my daughter, and she was in pain, and pain is pain regardless of what causes it. Your father loved you. That letter is real. What he felt for you is real, but he also saw what you were doing, and he was not going to let it happen. This is your fault, she said. You turned him against me. You know that isn't true, I said. You'll contest it. Gerald had nothing to do with this trust, I said. Patricia Nguyen drafted it. It is airtight. Your father made sure of that. Another silence. Longer. Cassandra, I said. The door is not closed. Your father said that in the letter, and I'm saying it now. But it has to be a real door. It has to be you and me, not you and the estate. She hung up without responding. Derek called an hour later. His voice had the quality of someone who has received genuinely bad news and is attempting to process it through practicality. He mentioned carefully that they intended to consult with their own legal team about the trust's validity. That's your right, I said. But I want you to know that Richard worked with one of the best estate attorneys in Connecticut for over a year specifically to ensure that there was no grounds for contest. I think you'll find that when your attorneys review the documents. He thanked me, which struck me as odd, and hung up. They did consult attorneys. 2 of them, in fact, over the following 2 months. Both attorneys told them I was informed through Patricia's office that the trust was structurally sound and legally unimpeachable. There were no grounds for contest. Richard had been of fully sound mind and legal capacity at the time of drafting. He had met all requirements. He had signed everything with witnesses and notarization. He had, in short, done everything exactly right, because Richard Hargrove had spent 35 years in business, and he knew how to close a deal that he wanted to stay closed. The legal challenges did not proceed. It is now 14 months since Richard died. I am still in my house. My house, $4 million of Tudor architecture, and 3 acres of garden that belong to me entirely, that no one can take, that no document Cassandra presents on any kitchen table will ever transfer out of my hands. I am still running my design business, though at a slower pace, because I am 61, and I have earned the right to work only on the projects that genuinely interest me. I had dinner with Matthew and Clara and the girls at Christmas, and Matthew hugged me for a long time at the door when I arrived and said, Dad knew exactly what he was doing. And I said, he always did. Cassandra and I have not spoken since the January phone call. I do not know if we will. I keep the door open in my heart, as Richard asked me to, as I believe he would want me to. I do not know if she will ever choose to walk through it. I think that is, ultimately, her choice to make. What I know is this. Richard Hargrove loved me for 32 years, and he spent the last year of his life making sure that love would continue to protect me after he was gone. He saw what was happening in his own family, with the same clear-eyed precision he brought to everything else in his life, and he did not pretend it wasn't happening, and he did not handle it with anger or recrimination. He handled it with planning, with care, with the quiet, methodical attention to detail that was the foundation of everything he had ever built. He left me a letter, too, Mine was longer than Cassandra's. I have read it so many times that I know it by heart. Every word, every line, his careful handwriting on the paper with the small embossed R in the corner. He wrote about our life together. He wrote about the things he was most grateful for. He wrote about the night we got married and the wind that kept threatening to take down the tent, and how he had looked at me during the vows and known, with absolute certainty, that this was where he was supposed to be. He wrote, "You were always the strongest person in any room you entered, Michelle. You just didn't always know it. I hope, after I'm gone, that you know it." I folded that letter, and I put it back in the jewelry box, next to Patricia Nguyen's card, in Richard's careful handwriting, and I went into the garden. The maples were bare. The light was gray. The garden was dormant, waiting for spring. I knew it. I want to say one more thing before I go. This story is not about money. I know it involves a lot of money. I know that when I tell you about trust documents and estate attorneys and $26 million, it sounds like a story about wealth and its distribution. But that is not what it is about. It is about the difference between people who love you and people who see you as a resource. It is about the extraordinary, ordinary miracle of being loved by someone who, in the final year of his life, with everything else he was carrying, still thought about what would happen to you after he was gone. If you have someone like that in your life, I want you to pause this video right now and go tell them what they mean to you. Not tomorrow, right now, because time is finite and it runs out faster than you think. And the people who truly love you, who love you without calculation, without agenda, without an eye on the bottom line, those people are the rarest and most valuable thing in the world. Richard knew that. He always knew that. And because he knew it, so do I. If this story moved you, if something in it resonated with something in your own life, please leave me a comment below. I read every single one. And if you're new here and you found value in this story, please subscribe. I share stories about love and family and the complicated, beautiful, difficult truth of human relationships. And there is more coming that I think you'll want to hear. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss anything. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next one.